Hello, I'm Lucid. This third and potentially final coronavirus video will be about the new normal that we're entering into and brainstorming what that might look like. The first video was to raise the alarm about the magnitude of the death toll, the potential duration of quarantine, and it went over the calculations I did early in February to come to that conclusion. The second video was a set of conditional predictions that people could use to plan and prepare for the situation. So before we get into this brainstorming of the new normal, let's revisit some of those conditional predictions from the previous video. In that prediction video from 3 weeks ago, when the national death toll was at 400, I tried to emphasize that we were locked in for a 17,500 person death toll by the evening of April 9th, no matter what containment measures we put in place to reduce the spread of infection. And late last night, on April 9th, we hit 17.5 thousand deaths in the United States. As far as I can tell, getting that number exactly right 3 weeks in advance was the most specific and accurate prediction put out by any agency or individual during this entire pandemic. Now, another prediction from that video was that by about April 4th, hospitals would fill up, and that by about April 7th, ICUs would fill up, and we would start to rely on makeshift field hospitals built in convention centers and gymnasiums and auditoriums around the country. And we can see that nearly 700 field hospitals have already been set up in convention centers and even parking garages around the country to deal with the overflow from the hospitals. Now, obviously, not all hospitals and ICUs fill up at the same rate, and not all makeshift field hospitals will be completed on the same day. But more or less, we can see that hospitals in major cities are at capacity, and they're needing to rely on these convention centers and stadium field hospitals more and more. Another prediction was that by the beginning of April, it would begin to be difficult to get an accurate tally of the dead, based on correlating with the Italian response in the Lombardy region. Nurses and doctors said that they got to a point where it was very difficult for them to accurately account for the number of people dying each day. Now that we passed the locked-in death toll of 17.5 thousand people late on April 9th, it's not going to be possible to project specific accurate scenarios for the next 3-week time period, or really at any point going forth, because things are going to start happening in bursts. There will be a spike of deaths in New Orleans or Detroit coming up, but there might be a reduction in deaths in New York City, and it'll continue more and more erratically over the rest of the year, where there will be an outbreak or an epicenter in one place and leveling off somewhere else. Now, the target audience of these videos is my friends and their friends, and the purpose of these videos is to visualize and brainstorm what's about to happen so that we can prepare accordingly. So in these videos, I've used the terms martial law and quarantine colloquially because we have a shared understanding of what martial law and quarantine would look like, but that's outside of the actual definition of those terms, so I'm going to talk about them in a little bit of depth because they're both really important to what's about to happen. When we're referring to quarantine or lockdown interchangeably, we're just talking about the restriction of the movement of people within civilization to prevent the transmission of the virus. This might look like getting fines for leaving your house, or any type of enforced social distancing, checkpoints in cities, anything done to prevent the flow of people from one place to another. So I don't use the term martial law to refer to a civilian government being replaced by a military government or anything so ethereal that doesn't affect us on a daily basis. I mean, functionally, like soldiers in the streets in armored personnel carriers enforcing quarantine or moving bodies from place to place. It means laws being suspended, or police declaring that they're not going to enforce the laws, or police being absent entirely, or 911 hanging up on you if you're not calling about something that's immediately life-threatening. So the term martial law was referring to soldiers in the streets maintaining the basic functions of civilization once it has otherwise fallen apart. And we had seen that in New Orleans or New York City after Hurricane Katrina or Sandy, where it was necessary to bring in large numbers of National Guard to maintain basic order and rebuild and establish field hospitals and that type of thing. So saying that martial law would be necessary to combat coronavirus in the United States is certainly technically inaccurate and functionally exactly what we're seeing, in the sense that there are now 40,000 troops in the streets in the United States combating coronavirus, and there will be tens of thousands more deployed over the coming weeks. Because of the National Guard, about 20% of them serve in civilian emergency services or are medical personnel already. So calling them out of those crucial functions to serve basically the same function on a military level isn't productive. So the US military will continue to play a larger and larger role in combating coronavirus around the country. And people in the cities most affected by coronavirus at any one time, experiencing a peak in mortality, will expect to see soldiers in the streets and armored personnel vehicles, and should expect a general suspension of laws, either from the police force being sick or incapacitated or just too overwhelmed to respond to calls. So seeing soldiers in the streets conducting the basic functions of civilizations will be part of the new normal going forward. But what else does the new normal look like? Well, we're going to get into a period, at least through this summer and into the fall, of pulses of infection and mortality with economic activity and restriction. It won't be a slow and steady increase with a gentle slope on the backside. Each city, each region, each state will be experiencing a push and pull of economic activity versus mortality from week to week and month to month, well into the fall, if not for the foreseeable future. So what that looks like is a massive spike in deaths in one city happening kind of by surprise, followed by a massive restriction in the flow of movement and the closing of businesses, where another city in another state nearby might be more or less normal for 2 or 3 weeks in this maybe frenzied hurry of activity to get industry and general functions operating before they need to again restrict their movements to prevent an outbreak of new disease that had undoubtedly been reintroduced into those once stable regions. This new normal will include more and more checkpoints, both within cities and between states, possibly just looking at a person's immediate symptoms and temperature, but almost certainly accompanying wide-scale testing, both for the virus itself and antibody testing to see who's functionally immune to the virus and who can go back to normal activity. And this implies a certain amount of everyone being tested compulsorily and needing to show the status of their testing frequently within cities and between states in order to regain normal movement. If a vaccine can be made, we should expect it to be more or less mandatory in the same way that a hepatitis vaccine is mandatory in schools and kids can be expelled if they don't have it. I don't think it's out of the question to assume that we might eventually see a situation where even to get into a grocery store, you would need to have a card that you scan upon entering that shows where you're at in your progression of the virus, whether you're immune or have been recently vaccinated or are a contamination risk, quote unquote, or something to that effect. Or eventually that your phone displays your status kind of electronically so that basically alarm goes off when you go into a grocery store saying that you're a potential contamination risk. Now, I'm obviously not saying I agree with this practice, but I don't at all think it's unreasonable to say that we could see that happening in the next year. Now, this is almost the fastest possible tanking of the economy and unemployment short of a nuclear war, much faster and more intense than the Great Depression. So we will see many cities opening back up, despite the consequences, probably proportional to the capacity of the field hospital set up by the Army Corps of Engineers. Now, this is what I was getting at with the plateau graph on the first video, saying that we're going to try to stabilize at the maximum capacity of any given hospital system, because that's also the maximum capacity of the economy without creating mortality spikes. So this shifting economy is going to accompany most likely a very rapid transition into automation that would have been hard for us to visualize 6 months ago, where self-driving Mack trucks and fully automated fast food restaurants and things of that nature will become commonplace very quickly, I'm guessing. Now, while a lot of manufacturing will come back into the United States due to our desire not to have medical equipment and pharmaceuticals made in China, for example, that won't substantially change employment because that type of thing will be automatically automated, I would guess, and the skyrocketing unemployment will cause wages to go way down as it does while people are desperately competing for the few remaining jobs. It's quite possible that we won't be able to protest any of this in the classical sense of standing in the streets with thousands of people and signs, not just because it would be a bad idea for the transmission of the virus, but I think it will quite possibly be illegal moving forward, and they will use overwhelming force to prevent large groups of people from spontaneously assembling. So this kind of extreme version of a hyper-technological Great Depression will require some of the same remedies on a personal level that we saw happening during the Great Depression, namely having the ability to produce your own food and water and basic essentials. So if you can, you should move as rapidly as possible such that it's still convenient to some form of growing food and being able to obtain water and making the most basic things for yourself. You don't need to make your own biodiesel necessarily, but if you have the ability to get eggs and vegetables from your yard, you should move in that direction. If I'm wrong, and everything goes back exactly the way it was before this, not only will that kill the world, but now you have a bunch of vegetables and eggs. And try to be closer to the ecosystem. Mentally, emotionally, but physically, try to move closer to the ecosystem. Not only is it the most important thing in the universe and the only thing that's real, but it's where food and water comes from. Food and water doesn't come from the grocery store, it comes from nature. There's a couple tiny little pockets of nature left that haven't been exterminated. You should get familiar with them, because whether we make a sci-fi dystopia or whether civilization starts attacking itself, you're gonna want to know where food and water comes from. So those are the practical matters. I'd like to take a step back now and take a look at the entire situation and speculate more freely about some possibilities of how this might turn out. Now picture the extreme luxury associated with having a house to go back to and a bunch of food that you can put in it and the ability to not work and to have social distance. All of these things can only be afforded by the wealthiest people in the wealthiest nations. So the impact on, say, like India or Yemen or much of the Middle East or all of Africa is that they can't social distance. They don't have access to proper sanitation and washing their hands in medical facilities. In Malawi, there's a doctor for like every 80,000 people. They can't build massive field hospitals instantaneously to take care of the overflow. So there will be tremendous, not just mortality in those places, but civil instability and regional conflict. And if you match that with economies that are based on a high oil price and the turmoil behind oil dropping below $20 a barrel for a prolonged period of time, there's going to be minor regional conflicts around the world because of this disease. You can see how it happens for more minor reasons. This will cause severe regional instability. Even within the United States, poor and disenfranchised people are being disproportionately affected by the disease and seeing much higher mortality rates, and states are starting to compete with each other and act more and more like separate countries. Not to say that they will fully separate, but that those divisions within cities and within states are being seen even in more economically developed nations. And since I'm now freely speculating on possibilities, I think it's not impossible that a war breaks out between major powers because of this pandemic, in the sense that when one nation is perceived as being particularly weak, whether it's because the military has a high infection rate or the economy is tanked or soldiers are being predisposed to take care of their own society, I think it's not outside of the realm of possibility that another major power will strike them to obtain the things that they have desired this entire time. For example, Russia has wanted more access to the Atlantic Ocean forever. That's why they seized Crimea. They have a hard time, and only in a couple of locations can they even peripherally access the Atlantic Ocean. China has wanted more access to the Pacific Ocean. It seems like they have a huge coastline, but it's surprisingly difficult for them to get past Japan and the Philippines and through the South China Sea, not only to complete their Belt and Road Initiative of having more influence over the Afro-Eurasian continent, but through the rest of the Pacific as well. Those nations allied have a common interest of not necessarily expansion, but of more certainty that they have access to the rest of the world. And NATO, just roughly, Western Europe and the United States are the hardest hit nations now from this pandemic. They're going to get to a point where economically, militarily, and in realm of general function of civilization, they'll be impacted so strongly simultaneously that some peripheral piece of those nations are subject to a lightning fast type of strike. These are just hypothetical things to ponder, but it's not so far outside of the realm of possibility that we shouldn't imagine it and its implications. So I'd like to end on a positive note, since I'm still freely speculating, This is the best and possibly last opportunity for us to modify the actions of global civilization in such a way that it can behave symbiotically with nature and the ecosystem rather than parasitically upon it. The positive side of increased automation is that a lot of those jobs were terrible and people really shouldn't have been doing them. A positive side of unemployment is that a lot of those jobs were terrible and people really shouldn't have been doing them. This gives them an opportunity to work in a better direction. While the free market might say that it's 3 cents cheaper per unit to make something in another country, we might see a massive shift towards domestic manufacturing of essentials, say medical equipment and medications initially, but even to communities creating their own food and textiles and other essentials in way higher abundance, because even if it's 10 times more expensive for a small town to make essential, say, textiles or food than it would be to buy them from the other side of the world, we may start seeing the necessity to have that means of production distributed locally for exactly these types of situations. The result could be that considerably fewer frivolous things are created just because there happens to be slave labor to make them in some densely packed country, but also that we are making things more organically. And even though petroleum is functionally as cheap as it's ever been right now, we could very well see this being a catalyst to the production of localized renewable energy, because in the same way that it'll be necessary to produce essential resources and food from community to community so that you're not worried about complex supply chains that lead to the other side of the world, or even supply chains that lead into adversarial nations, we might realize the importance of producing our own energy in each community so that you're not relying on refineries on the opposite side of the country. We knew that there wasn't much time left to change the trajectory of civilization in such a way that it didn't more or less exterminate life on Earth in the process of its own viral kind of growth. So this is quite possibly the shock to the system that was necessary to apprehend the reins of a mechanism we had created accidentally that was running haywire. This pause in the self-oriented structure of society so that neighbors can help neighbors is also showing us that altruism and community engagement and concern for the wider world is our default natural setting. So as we reconnect our lifeline to the nature that we still are, let's put more of our time and energy into the kind of action-oriented altruism that will determine what kind of world this event creates.